Okay, so now let's think about how to solve collective action problems. There are two sides again to solving collective action problems. One is a descriptive and one is a normative aspect of this issue. The descriptive aspect is to ask how, if at all, do people actually solve collective action problems? I mean, do they ever solve them? And can we maybe learn something from the conditions under which they do solve them for the conditions under which it seems difficult to solve them, like the climate crisis, like vaccination, like the destruction of wildlife, like the pollution of the oceans. Okay. So can we learn something from those cases when we do solve them? Are there cases where we solve them, and can we learn from them? Normative questions are: can we somehow? It's the problem partly noticed was generated by the idea that it somehow is rational for the individual to defect. It's some way of arguing that actually cooperating in a collective action can be rational. Another way to think about it is different, to make a distinction between what's rational and what's moral. Maybe what's rational isn't what is moral. Maybe free riding of the efforts of others is something that's immoral, even though there's something that rationality contributes. So the distinction between rationality and morality is also possible, a way of addressing this. Now, let's look at the descriptive question. The person who's done most to study how collective action problems are actually solved is Elinor Ostrom. She is an economist who has won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. And she studied common resource use in many different scenarios around the globe. And what she finds is that successful management of common resources, like the commons, is in fact quite common when we look at small-scale communities. So, for example, when we looked at this example of the English villages that sent the cows or sheep to the common land, and then the collective action problem is that it seems to overuse the land by sending more and more sheep or cows to the piece of land. If you look at actual commons, find that in Swiss Alp villages, for example, in some villages, they've had a common piece of land like this, and they've been using it successfully since the 16th century. She also looked at resource management in communities from African villages to Nepal, and she finds that there too, they often manage quite successfully common resources. Based on her studies, she then has identified 8 design principles that she finds are in general involved when people successfully solve commons problems. So here's 4 that I picked out. The other ones you can just look it up on Wikipedia, for example, or you can find out more about it in other places. It needs to be clear what the pool of resources is. It's not always clear what the common resource is. So, and for example, this is not clear in some of the cases of, say, the climate. It's not so clear in the oceans. What exactly is the common resource? This needs to be clear. It needs to be the case that the parties who are using the common resource, they must actually decide together. So this is important. In the case of the prisoner's dilemma, these 2 people, Tony and Griselda, they didn't talk to each other. So what she finds is that if people can actually communicate, if they can actually talk to each other to solve these problems, they're much more likely to find a solution. Another design principle is there must be sanctions, punishment of some sort when you violate these community rules. These don't necessarily have to be, sent to prison or pay fines. Maybe it's just that your people talk badly about you. People call you out for being a bad person, things like that. Finally, another thing I'd like to mention, there must be rules for how to resolve the conflict. There must be some procedures that are in place for what happens if there's a conflict, if there's too many sheep there. How do you deal with the situation? There must be some rules in place. If there are rules in place, then people are able to successfully solve collective action problems. Okay. Now let's look at the rational question. How can it be rational to solve collective action problems? Okay. I want to look at 3 types of strategies here. And well, I'll talk through them. One is, note that the problem arises because I do not know whether the other person will collaborate or defect. If I had some kind of insurance or evidence that the other person is going to be a collaborator, that someone who's going to collaborate on this interaction, then I can use that. Okay. And this insurance idea is something that can be very relevant if you're looking at iterated prison's dilemma cases. So where we are interacting now and reacting again and again and again. So think about the common use of this piece of land for many 100 years in this Swiss village, but you can also think about this in our case of the oceans and so on, that we're actually playing this game again and again and again and again. In that case, you can use, for example, the fact that someone has in the past collaborated for reason to as a reason to cooperate with that person specifically on the next occasion. And that's often, it's called a tit for tat strategy for repeated prisoners dilemma. So tit for tat, I collaborate. If you cooperate, I will also cooperate in the next move. If you defect, I will defect as well. So it's shown that if you play such iterated games, you can actually achieve cooperation. The same is true if you play these games on spatial structures where you're more likely to interact with some people than other people. You're going to get actually islands of cooperation, beautiful computer simulations that show that you're going to get islands of cooperation that actually will increase and then it will shrink again, increase and shrink, but you're going to get collaboration for some period of time. That's partly because you're going to have some insurance that the neighbors are cooperators. You're more likely, if your neighbor, because that's how the cooperation spreads, is a higher chance that your neighbors are cooperative, you're a cooperator. So you're going to be, the cooperators are going to kind of like more likely to get to be together. Okay, so there's a different way of thinking about getting a rational solution to the collective action problem. Is to change the payoff matrix. I mean, in a sense, it's cheating, but arguably in real world, it's not really cheating. So, if, for example, you saw in the Ostrom's case that she added sanctions for those who overuse the land or such like things like that. So we defect. If you add sanctions to the defect option, then you're going to increase the if you add sanctions to the defect option, then you're going to then defect option won't dominate the cooperation option anymore. You can do that calculation for the actual prisoners dilemma with Griselda and Tony, for example, if you think, well, let's assume that not the only thing that counts is the number of years in prison, but that if you have defected, if you have called you out, then you're going to be punished later on by the mafia. So it's going to change the game. You can also change the preferences. So suppose that people don't actually just care for years in prison, they have altruistic preferences. They actually want to help the others out also. If that's the case, you're going to play a different game, and therefore the preference, the payoff matrix is going to look different, and then you can get things that look like, then you can get cooperation as a stable strategy. The final thing is that it's possible to as well play a different game. So I think that you can change the unit of agency. So we have here is agents playing against each other. But if they only could think of themselves as part of a team, part of a group that tries to optimize their outcome, if Tony and Griselda could do that, they can just think of themselves together. What should we do if we want what's best for us together? Then they'll both cooperate. So those have defended team reasoning, so-called. They have thought about this idea of changing the unit of agency from the individual to the team of which the individual is a part. Where we're not playing against each other anymore, but we are as well together playing against nature. We're trying to optimize our outcome. That's another way to think about it. And I've linked to a paper by Catherine Brown on that suggests this as a solution to the coronavirus situation. Okay, that's it for now. Looking forward to our discussions. Thanks.